yes, the best game.
So. All right. Okay, guys. Let's continue. Sorry, it took a bit longer. Here's today's a bit of an interesting problem because I have another class after that and they don't have a room. So I'm currently improvising. So they will probably be coming in here in 25 minutes. So by that time we'll be finished anyway. But just to prompt you already. So it's a bit chaotic and I need those few minutes to coordinate this. Cool. So let's just wrap up the idea of mocking right now, and then I want to show you another convenience library that you probably want to think about using, or you may have seen something else in different languages. So where were we? We wanted to write a minimal mock for a web service, simple invocation, and the discussion was previously, well, how can we do that by avoiding and avoid problems with you know, not being able to predict the request pointer here that would be invoked by any client that we have, right? So, so that's why we are fixing that right now here. So we have created a mock. So sorry, first we had created an interface, then we have created a controller, and then now instantiated the mock, meaning injected the controller into the mocked interface. Again, just to recall, the generated mock looks like that. It reflects the interface of the original server, but it basically has the mock server, you know, the recorder attached to it, so basically you can inspect all the invocations. Cool. So for the mock, we obviously want to specify expected invocations, so it'd be something like request and what would we expect as an invocation. Well, stick to my very creative representation of content, and we expect at least, let's say, well, for now, one invocation. So, and then we can basically use that mechanism here to inject a request to your fake web service. So this one here, so the HTTP test web service. And we just basically invoke the request manually and redirecting the input that we get into the request. So hang on, that is, I think it's a byte array initially, so we probably need to get that first. Hang on. How do we achieve that? IUtil is the go-to tool for those kind of purposes. Well, at least for me. It's not always recommended, but it's a quick and dirty way of doing this. So what's the issue here? Hang on, probably missing. Yeah, the arrow check, so which we, yeah, well, let's be good people here. Right, if arrow is not nil, then since we're in the test environment, we should be able to say test error, error doing decoding. And then we have the content available. The content is now, hang on, available as byte array, so we want to stringify that one. And then we can inject the mock this way. That should probably do the job. We create the server with a test server that we keep a reference to. So we have the URL, and I'm going back to here. Hang on, let me clean up here first. And take that and put it into here. So we do it all in one function. It's quite straightforward. And then we can reference the URL simply by saying ts.url, which is a string anyway. Cool. So we send some content. Let's try to get that right, and see how that fares. So we're creating a server. We need to defer the shutdown of the server. So defer ts.close. Mock control finish will be done at the end. Alright, let's see what that but that brings clean up a bit. Seems to be a bit of a don't need to anyway. So mock server testing. What else did I forget? The signature looks okay for a test, I think. What else did I forget? Does anyone spot any issue here? Start with tests. Ah, right, yes, sure. This one is wrong. Obviously need to rename the file accordingly. It needs to be called as a suffix test. So now we have an executable test function. So what it's doing is creating a mock. We specify a symbol expectation. We tear up or bring up a server, we tear it down afterwards. We tear it down at the end hopefully, and we have a single invocation. So let's run this, see what's happening. Oh, that works well. Should it work well? Yep, that probably should work well. So let's see if we can break it. Yeah, that's better. So missing call to mock server request. So we would want to have 2 invocations. We only got 1. So that would be a simple way of using a mock in an HTTP test server. So quite straightforward. What we basically do is just to redirect any outside call that we get from elsewhere and redirect it into the mock, but we specify the expectation before that outside. So this whole thing would basically be then the test invocation. So recall that we have this idea of arrange and then X, basically doing the execution, and then doing the evaluation. So the evaluation is basically done in this statement at the very end. We bring up and specify the environment, which we can conveniently do this way, and this is the core content that we actually arranging and executing ultimately, and this invokes the execution down here. So if you have multiple requests, for example, you can specify them down here. It's quite straightforward. It's literally only a string being sent to that HTTP test service URL, nothing more than that. Cool. So one final thing I wanted to show you in terms of test frameworks, and that brings us pretty much back to the original test that I looked at. Have you done testing in other languages before? Anyone? Yep.
Briefly in PHP, the first assignment this semester.
Cool. What did you use? Did you use a framework or manually or?
Yeah, framework, but we just downloaded what he told us to download. So he had mostly written the tests for us.
Ah, so okay.
We were filling in
The gaps.
Yeah.
Cool, sweet. Yep, sounds good. I'm just right now. You notice looking at testing more generally. Right now, we find that. Or you may find that our testing is kind of coarse-grained. We basically do some manual logical checks, whatever else. For example, we're checking on content, and then we throw an error if that's not what we expect it to be, right? So we always reference the test pointer and then call some error function, and it basically means things go sideways and everything is doomed. But there's another kind of a framework which I came across in that respect, and I think it's worthwhile for you knowing the principle and syntax, because you will use that most likely in other programming languages. So I felt it's worthwhile exploring the idea, and this is called Testify. It's actually a framework down here, and I just briefly want to go through some of the functionality with you, just to know how you can make your tests possibly a bit more concise. So the, obviously you need to download it. Go get, now I need to get the URL, which is github.com/stretcher. And I bet there will be more frameworks coming, but the interface is fairly known. So meaning if you're coming from, for example, have been testing in Java using JUnit, you'll be very comfortable with the interface. That's why I want to highlight this. Well, or the other way around, if you're moving to another programming language, which you ultimately will, you will see in how far you can actually write much more concise tests in a relative short time. So let's see if it picks it up. Assert, yeah, that's something. Cool. And generally you deal with something like assert statements, if you do in JUnit, for example, as well. And it usually follows the syntax. I use a more straightforward one. Assert equals, for example, equal. Yes. So this would be a typical interface you would expect, that you actually in one single call specify the expected outcome, then the actual outcome, and then the message that's attached to the non-compliance, right? So right now we had the conditional check here, and that requires 3 lines of code. It's a bit complex, so we can just make it quite straightforward and much more simple. So for example, if we want to represent this test down here, we just need to inject the reference to the test. We specify the expected content, which is hard-coded sum content, in this case. That's the test we wrote yesterday. So, and then the actual content that points to the message content that we received from the invocation, and then whatever, web service response does not correspond to, and then some content. So you can actually have much more meaningful feedback, especially if you write a large number of tests. I personally find it much easier to deal with than writing a lot of conditional statements and still being limited to the very generic error messages that you will be exposed to. So if you run this one, for example, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Let's assume that we change the expectation for the test, and we can rerun it. Quite straightforward. And it should fail. And you get, I think, a bit more of a meaningful error trace. If you look down here, I'll just pull that up a bit. So you have pretty much more like an error log. So if you write large number of tests, a lot easier. Please.
This will work with the test coverage percentage as well, so we can use it on the assignment?
It shouldn't affect you at all, because the test coverage is just based. I just need to check if I just disturbed my setup camera server here. The test coverage shouldn't be disturbed at all, because the test coverage just looks what of your code is actually invoked or somewhat processed using that test function. So it doesn't really affect it. It's just the convenience method, because that's technically not test coverage anyway. Test coverage looks at the actual code that you, production code that you're testing, invoking. This is just environment for your testing. It will never have any relevance in production code in the first place, right? So this is just, see it as a convenience syntax of specifying tests a lot easier. That's what I want to get at here. And if you get comfortable with this, you'll definitely come across that again, at least in Java, also in C++, in NTest, C# test frameworks, and so on. So it's various of those things. You can test for nil, not nil, and so on. So they always have the kind of same pattern. For example, you can assert not nil for, again, need to find a reference here to the testing. Not nil, for example, M should not be nil, could be an expectation that you have as well. And then, well, M is nil. Let's see if that's... So it won't break because it doesn't break. If you assert, however, that M should be nil, then we probably get an error here, obviously, because it's not nil. Yeah, so expected nil but got not nil. So you can see the error trace, and they also pointed to array lines. So it's quite convenient, this way of specifying errors. I hope that makes somewhat sense, my rather concise way of just showing the framework. Again, I will put up the slides this afternoon. And then you will Here is the reference to that framework. It's called Testify. If there's any other framework of that nature that provides this functionality, let me know. I'm kind of keen to see to know what's out there. But I had the impression that this was a broadly adopted way of doing this. Cool. If you want to read more on mocking in particular, so there will be some links here, particularly the one by Martin Fowler differentiates between mocks and stubs, but I think you should intuitively have gotten an idea. I added the Go mock tutorial, so if you want to use it yourself and get the commands explicitly and so on, and know a bit more what they're doing, you can have a look at this. But I think you have a recipe already as part here as part of this slide. So basically get the packages, specify your interface, generate the mock from the interface, and then write the mock using the patterns we use, using the mock controller and so on. You can just use the code that we wrote today. I will upload this one into a dedicated repository. I hadn't done this yesterday, but now we have a complete picture and I clean it up a bit and we'll upload it somewhere. Please, one thing to bear in mind, if you think about mocking in your assignment in particular, what's the important thing you need to do? If you think about using GoMock.
Use interfaces?
Use interfaces, yeah, number one. Yeah, but so if you use that, what's the important step that you need to consider as well when you submit your assignment? Well, it's not super intuitive, but you may be inclined just to submit your code you actually wrote, but you may not submit the generated code, right? So that we generally don't commit binaries, for example, right? So if you write code or any code that can be regenerated based on the source that we have, plus frameworks, should be done this way. But the problem is here, we wouldn't necessarily know if you have mocked or not. So you will also need to commit the mocked implementation, right? In this example, here you would need to not only commit the mock object, which is the interface, hence the interface, but also the produced implementation, so mockgen.go, whatever else. Yeah, it's important. Else your test will fail because we will not regenerate this automatically. Again, right? We don't know if you used it, so you need to commit this as well. I put an extra slide in there, you know, just to make sure. Please consider that if you want to do mocking. You know, please commit the output of mockgen as well. Cool. That's it for now. I think enough mocking. So tonight, I think if you're keen exploring mocking in a service on yourself, on your own service, that's probably a good option. Other than that, continue to your assignment or start with it, especially given the relatively complete specification now. Last night I added a few more you know, bells and whistles here and there, and the response specification for the webhooks that we are expecting. So have a look at this. You can debug it further, and we can explore whether there are still gaps that we need to fill or clarify the assignment. And there were some concrete ideas and problems faced, so that we can address as well. So if you feel like that, please join us tonight. Other than that, there will obviously be no new content as such. It's more like a clarification and support session. Cheers. Thank you very much. So I'll have another class coming here at sharp at 1 p.m. and we'll give it just here spontaneously. So don't be surprised if they just rush in a few minutes. Or I will be surprised if they don't, in fact, but we'll see. Thank you very much.